Hey everyone, Warix here. So we've done the entire Monk Academy series, and we'll have level 80 quick guides coming soon. As I record this, I'm in my journey for leveling with War Within, as I did not get early access, but, we're level 75 before I jump in to finish up my leveling on Monk tonight. In today's video though, I wanted to cover my predictions on how Monk will be within Season 1 of The War Within for both Mythic Plus and Raid. Now I'm not generally into future casting or in the prediction business. I've done a series in the past, very far in the past, about how all 12 classes were in BFA, and I might do something like that again because I love doing the data analysis piece. But I wanted to take an opportunity to try something a little different and predict what I think is going to be the case for each monk spec when it comes to Raid and Mythic Plus, particularly focused around Race to World First and high-end keys. Now this is just my view on the class and may not reflect actual data because we don't really have any yet, or the monk community view at large. Let's start with reverse alphabetical order and we'll go with Windwalker. Windwalker got a whole rework very early in the alpha cycle that was widely well regarded. Having played the spec quite a bit since pre-patch, I can agree that that has been a good rework. I think the pathing options in the trees, both of them, are better, and the general choices we have now versus the old tree is a big step up in quality. Your build isn't so focused heavily on like one or two abilities, but incentivizes you to have strong abilities across your board. Some quality of life changes were made that were, I think, brilliant, beginning with White Tiger statue, that now instead of being its own button, it just summons when you summon Juen, is a very good change. And Serenity being removed in favor of making SEF even better and making it one of the more fun and interesting cooldowns in the game is, to me, one of the best decisions that they made in the tree. Now, there are some downsides. Recently, they did make a change where cleave abilities such as the talent Shadowboxing Treads, where your Blackout Kick hits other targets, no longer applies Mark of the Crane. Anyone unaware, Mark of the Crane is a debuff that goes onto your targets that when you use Rising Sun Kick or Blackout Kick, I believe Tiger Palm as well, it applies an 18% damage amp to your Spinning Crane Kick. Only primary targets from you and your Stormearth and Fire clones can apply it, as your Stormearth and Fire clones do apply Mark of the Crane to targets that they hit. So now you have a bit more setup. So a quick example is that if you have 8 targets and you pop your Stormearth and Fire and you hit Blackout Kick, you will only mark 4 of those targets, whereas in the past you would be able to mark all 8 targets with 1 Blackout Kick. So this increases the setup and ramp up time in AoE a little bit, and as a result I think probably puts a ceiling on the spec's viability in mass pull situations, especially when you start getting into the really high keys. That said, again, so going back to some of the good changes, Whirling Dragon Punch does feel good to use, and the choice node below it, where you can either get 4 stacks of your Ancient Teachings on the Monastery, or the guaranteed Dance of Chi-Ji procs, makes Whirling Dragon Punch valuable in both single target and AoE situations, which is quite nice. Haste scaling was added, making Windwalker a haste-based class now, for the first time really ever, and that makes the spec actually feel very good. The spec still feels very good to play. I think they did a great job of making sure that they did not include, or rather, they did not take away any of the fact that the flow of Windwalker has always felt good to play. They just tightened it up in a lot of ways. Now, are we going to see Windwalker in Race to World First or in the highest key like Metacomp push groups? I don't think so. I think Windwalker is going to be very good for pretty much 98% of the rest of the content, but I don't think we're going to see it in those really peak scenarios. Let's talk about why. Mystic Touch is among the weakest raid buffs. Only a handful of specs now do majority physical damage. It's like Warrior, Feral Druid, Marksmanship Hunter, Windwalker, but really like obviously Prout Warrior and Brewmaster Monk in a way. But really a lot of the specs that would used to benefit a lot from Mystic Touch benefit a lot more from Chaos Brand now. In fact, Chaos Brand and subsequently Arcane Intellect were recently nerfed because they provided too much value in a lot of ways. While it's unlikely Race to World First and Hall of Fame, even top 200 guilds will skip monks because they want to try and min-max every point of damage that they can, I think there are going to be guilds that are cutting edge that will not lose much by skipping a monk if they don't already have a dedicated monk player on their roster. Mystic Touch just doesn't bring the same value anymore, and I think it's something that Blizzard needs to keep very much on their radar, especially when you have like Elun's Chosen for Guardian Druid being very powerful, You have the Black Arrow tree being very powerful, or being pretty good for ranged hunters. Like, there's just a lot of specs that are starting to infuse much more magic damage into the kit, and physical damage is starting to fall by the wayside, and I don't like that. Now, that said, Windwalker, I think it's fine. The biggest problem that it has right now is that I just think there are other specs that are way better. Defensively, Windwalker is slightly nerfed with the removal of Dampen Harm, and Yu'lon's Grace took a pretty significant nerf in beta, but they're still overall solid with Diffuse Magic, Touch of Karma, and Fortifying Brew. They have extremely high mobility with 3 charges of roll, lighter than air, transcendence, Tiger's Lust, so they can be very, very adept at getting themselves in and out of sticky situations in ways that, like a Death Knight or a Paladin or even a Shaman to a lesser extent, can't really do so. The hero talent trees, Shadowpan and Conduit of the Celestials aren't majorly impactful to the spec right now. Conduit of the Celestials, I think, is slightly better with the button that it does add, and Shadowpan is entirely passive. In AoE, Windwalker doesn't have fantastic, great, in terms of like burst damage in the most common talent setups that we see, but it has really good sustained AoE. So from an optic standpoint, even if it's not necessarily on an overall damage standpoint, classes like Fire Mage or Fury Warriors or Frost DKs that can burst very quickly with just a couple of button presses are going to look better than Windwalker does, where Windwalker's ceiling is a little bit lower right now, but its floor is much higher. And so I think that's kind of a damage profile situation that may need to be looked at, but I don't know if it's entirely a bad thing. I think specs that do sustain DPS in WoW is a good thing, and those are some of my favorite specs to play. Windwalker overall is a solid spec. It feels good to play and has much better talent options. The hero trees could probably use some excitement infused to them, and the spec needs some damage tuning, because I've seen like the best Windwalker players in the world are falling behind, significantly behind in damage to random Fury Warrior tester or random Enhancement Shaman tester. That said, if you're looking to play Windwalker, you'll be perfectly fine from a performance standpoint. I just don't think World First or Metacomp push keys are going to use them. If you want it on like a tier list like placement, which I generally hate doing, I would put it solidly in a B state. Let's move on to Mistweaver. Mistweaver saw enough changes that the spec the spec plays very differently, but I wouldn't necessarily call it fully reworked. The core of the spec is still very much the same through the fist weaving talent builds, but the things around it are very different. Mastery was buffed with Rising Sun Kick now contributing to the Gust of Mist, which makes Mastery slightly better in terms of a secondary stat. But they removed some aspects of the full quote-unquote caster builds with things like Clouded Focus and a couple of other talents all being removed. While this doesn't change the spec much in M+, as the spec in Mythic Plus throughout Dragonflight was a full-on fist-weaving Jadefire Stomp build, it definitely impacts raid builds where there's now a full fist-weaving build, and for a while there's like a full Soothing Mist like Yu'lon raiding build that's kind of floating around there right now. Blizzard's in an interesting position from a raid standpoint because fist weaving has historically not been very strong for raid healing, but is slowly becoming the default and almost only playstyle from Mistweaver. So something needs to be monitored very closely to help it make sure that it competes with other healers. Healer tuning is still a little weird, so there's still a lot of variability and unknown still, so we'll have to see how this plays out over the next few weeks. Will we see Mistweaver in Race to World First as a meta or second meta healer in the high key situations? In Raid, I actually think it's possible. Shaman, Evoker, and Paladin are all looking very strong as healers, but traditionally in that 4 spot you would see like a Disc Priest. Resto Druid is struggling. Shadow Priest looks like it might actually be the default choice for Priest because Disc and Holy are both kind of struggling, which means that the door is left open for Mistweaver Monk. I think if a guild feels like Shadow is the play for their 4th buff bot Priest character, then I fully expect Mistweaver to be that 4th healer. Mystic Touch has the same issues as Windwalker, we talked about those just a little bit ago, but the highest level guilds won't leave that free damage on the table like I said. Revival is a good raid cooldown, and the spec is somewhat flexible to adapt playstyles to encounter types. You can do a full fist weaving build if it's there. You can run a good single target healing setup through a Soothing Mist setup. You can run amazing raid healing through Renewing Mist Spread, Rising Mist, and Vivify Cleave. Like, it just has that ability to kind of adapt to whatever you need more, I think, in a way that other healers right now can't. That said, I think Mistweaver probably is the biggest wildcard spec, I believe, in the healing roster right now. And from a hero talent standpoint, Master of Harmony just has a ton of bugs, making it pretty unplayable right now, but Conjure the Celestials adds just enough to the total package for Mistweaver that it feels like it's a fun and interesting skill ceiling to determine when to use the ability and how to maximize all the little things that go around it. In Mythic Plus, I think Mistweaver will fall to the middle of the pack. This spec lacks the utility of the aforementioned Shaman, Evoker, and Paladin. It doesn't bring Battle Res or Aura Mastery, Blessing of Protection, and Blessing of Sacrifice like Paladin does. It's not a heroism spec like Resto Shaman and Preservation Evoker do. And for Shaman, Sky Fury is, I think, right now, one of the best raid buffs in the game. Dedicated Monk players are still going to perform very well, but I don't expect Mistweaver to dominate the Raider.io leaderboards like it did in Season 3 of Dragonflight. I think it does really well for mob control, but if you're lacking party utility, then you're going to be better off looking at another spec. Overall, I think Mistweaver is still a great healer. It's still, for me, by far the most fun I have playing healer. I think it's an A tier healer overall, but I'd say at the bottom of it, Paladin, Shaman, and Evoker are definitely ahead of it right now, in my opinion, with Disc Priest possibly being right there even with it, and then Holy Priest kind of in the struggle bus section. Finally, let's talk about Brewmaster. This spec didn't get wholesale changes, some new pathing in the spec tree, and a long overdue buff to stagger. The spec saw button bloat removed, with up to potentially 5 buttons being taken off your bars depending on tuning and your spec choices. Ox Dance down in the spec tree is a fantastic new talent, as is Elixir of Determination, even though it did get nerfed, probably rightfully so. The tree has now great options for a more pure defensive build, a pure offensive build, and even something like an open world build, which hasn't been the case ever for Brewmaster. So it's much more flexible as a tank to kind of, again, fit what it is you need to do. If damage is not a concern, but living is, then you can play a defensive build. If living's not as much of a concern, but it's a tight DPS check, then you can run your offensive build and contribute a lot more in that way. The hero talents, Master of Harmony and Shadowpan, both have viability for Brewmaster. Master of Harmony for a more defensive-oriented build, and Shadowpan for a more offensive-oriented build, which makes Brewmaster a much more flexible tank than really many of the other tanks, which feel locked into one hero talent tree right now. Will we see it in Race to World First to high key pushing teams? Let's start with Raid and Race to World First. I think Brewmaster's the most likely monk spec to see play in Raid. There are tanks that are very good. Death Knight, Bear, Prot Warrior for Mythic Plus, Demon Hunter's been getting some hype again. But other specs of those classes are really solid. Like Frost and Holy DK are looking very strong right now. Feral Druid is looking pretty good for a melee DPS option. DPS Warriors are looking really good. And Havoc is like still probably like it's easier to find a good Havoc player than it is a good Vengeance player. I think that you're most likely going to see DK and Monk as your most likely duo, because Blood DK AMZ is much more powerful than Frost or Unholy DK AMZ. And I think that you'll run like your battle shout through like a Fury Warrior, and you'll run your Mark of the Wild through a Feral Druid. That said, Bear can be replaced with DK if you feel like you need the Mark of the Wild, then you don't have like a Feral Druid or a Resto Druid specialist on your team. But for these Race to World First and these high level mythic guilds in these top 50, really I'd say like the top 50 guilds in the world, they've got enough flex healers that they can easily flex off Resto Druid or flex onto a Resto Druid if they need to. Brewmaster can do among the highest tank damage generally with the offensive build, and has a variety of defenses in Fort, Bruise, and Meditation, Dampen, Magic, Diffuse Harm, to really handle any major tank mechanics in a raid situation, so they can contribute heavily in that regard. So I think Brewmaster is likely going to be the most common monk that we see in these top guilds. I don't think it'll be the only one, but I think it'll be the most common one. In Mythic Plus, though, it's a little tough to tell. I think that Brewmaster competes with Demon Hunter, Warrior, and DK at this moment in time, Bear as well. But really, I think the DPS meta comps are going to play a big role. If we're in for like our 4th or 5th straight season of Wizard Cleave, where you run like Warlock, Shadow, Mage, Evoker, that sort of thing, then I think Monk loses a ton of value, and you see something like VDH or DK start to be really, really valuable. If we're in for a melee heavy comp, then Warrior could probably provide more damage through the attack power buff, which affects all abilities for these, for spell damage or for magic damage for melee. It's based off their attack power. So Battle Shout might actually contribute more than a physical damage increase will. So it's really, really hard to tell right now. There's a lot of variability, but I expect Brewmaster Specialists to perform very well. And I think a lot of high-end tanks are going to give Brewmaster a look until they kind of settle in on what they want to play as the VD, as their sort of meta comp or MDI, TGP type comps. Brewmaster on the downside still kind of punishes hard for misplays if you screw up your brews, but with enough repetition and learning of your damage patterns, you can easily kind of work around that. So I'm less concerned about it than what I would be in like Shadowlands. Or any of it in Dragonflight, but it is a spec that, unlike DK can punish for bad play, but like Bear doesn't really punish for bad play. Warrior, it can, but it's really hard to punish for bad play. And VDH can get punished for bad play, but once you get like 3 seconds into a pool, you really don't. I think Brewmaster is an A tier if you care about that sort of thing, but overall, Brewmaster I think is in a really great spot. And like I said, I think it's the most likely Monk we'll see in Race to World first, and it is possible you'll see it in some high key comps. So that's my thoughts on Monk for the Season 1 of The War Within. It's likely not going to be meta in a ton of places, but if you're dedicated to playing it, you should see a good amount of success. Blizzard has always been very good about the fact that if you can play a spec to an even decent degree, you're going to accomplish 99% of the goals that you have set for yourself. Really, this is only going to matter if you are in the 2.5 guilds that compete for Race to World first, or you're in like the top 0.5% where playing meta comps in Mythic Plus really, really matters. Outside of that, if you just want to play Monk, I think you're going to have a lot of success. I think if you want to have the most success playing Monk, you should probably be a tank, because we just need more tanks in this game, or play Mistweaver because we need healers in this game is always useful as well, and there are so many people that play DPS. That said, if Windwalker gets just enough tweaking and tuning to bring it up a notch or two, I think it'll be a very good, and it's still a very fun class to play. Monk still has a lot of tools to be successful, though. It has incredible mob control and incredible mobility that I think it's hard to challenge the mobility of Monk in a lot of ways. Demon Hunter, I think, can do it from a melee perspective, but there's not a lot of other specs that can, and I don't think any healer can challenge Mistweaver in terms of mobility. There are some glaring holes with Mistweaver. Those are things I'll probably talk about towards the end of the expansion and what I'd like to see for class changes for Midnight. But those types of holes aren't really probably going to be addressed unless they decide to rework the spec again in the middle of the expansion, which I doubt is going to happen. So that's my thoughts on Monk, guys. I hope you all stay safe. I hope you enjoy yourself. You're having fun. You keep on gaming. We'll see you in the next video.